The desert sun beat down mercilessly, each ray like a physical weight pressing against Thomas's weathered skin. His parched lips had cracked hours ago, the tiny droplets of blood drying almost instantly in the scorching heat. 3 days, 3 days without seeing another soul in this vast expanse of sand and rock. His water bottle, once full and promising, now held just enough for one final precious sip. Thomas squinted at the horizon, where heat waves danced and distorted the landscape. Was that movement a mirage, perhaps? Another cruel trick of this unforgiving terrain? But no, something was definitely moving toward him. Slow, stumbling, but deliberate. As the figure drew closer, Thomas could make out a woman, perhaps in her late 20s, her clothes torn and dirty, her gait unsteady. She was in worse shape than he was. Instinctively, his hand tightened around his water bottle. The last sip. The difference between life and death in this hellscape. His mind raced through calculations of how far the nearest town might be, whether he could make it without that final drop of moisture. Help. The woman's voice was barely audible, a raspy whisper carried on the hot wind. Please. Something in her eyes stopped him cold. Something hauntingly familiar that stirred memories buried deep within him. Memories of another time, another life, before everything fell apart. 28 years earlier, Thomas had been a different man. Young, ambitious, and deeply in love with Catherine. They had plans, dreams that seemed within reach, until that fateful night when their argument escalated, words becoming weapons that left wounds too deep to heal. He'd stormed out, driven away in a fury, unaware that Catherine had been trying to tell them something important, something that would have changed everything. By the time he cooled down enough to return home 3 days later, she was gone. No note, no forwarding address, just emptiness where their life together had been. His attempts to find her led nowhere. Catherine had disappeared, taking with her whatever secret she'd been trying to share. Thomas had rebuilt his life, piece by broken piece. He'd found success as a wildlife photographer, his work taking him to the most remote corners of the earth. The solitude suited him, helping to numb the ache of what he'd lost. But time hadn't completely healed those wounds. In quiet moments, he still wondered what had become of Catherine, what life might have been if he'd stayed and listened that night. Now, looking at this stranger stumbling toward him in the desert, Thomas felt an inexplicable connection. There was something about the shape of her eyes, the determined set of her jaw even in distress, that stirred long-dormant memories. Here, he said, extending the water bottle toward her. Take it. It's not much, but it's all I have. The woman collapsed to her knees in front of him, gratefully accepting his offering. Their fingers brushed, and Thomas felt a jolt, like static electricity, but deeper, more profound. She tilted her head back, allowing the last precious drops to fall onto her parched tongue. Thank you, she whispered, her voice slightly stronger now. I didn't think I'd make it. What are you doing out here alone? Thomas asked, settling beside her in the meager shade of a rocky outcropping. I'm looking for someone, she replied, studying his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. I've been searching for a long time. Thomas nodded, understanding the drive that could push someone beyond sensible limits. Family. A sad smile played across her lips. In a way, I never knew him. Something in her tone raised the hairs on Thomas's arms. The desert wind picked up, swirling dust around them, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. My mother died 6 months ago, the woman continued, her voice steady despite her physical state. Cancer. Before she passed, she gave me a box of letters and photographs she'd kept hidden my entire life. Letters about my father. Thomas's heart began to pound against his ribs. Impossible coincidences flashed through his mind, but he dismissed them. The desert heat was making him delirious, seeing connections where none existed. I'm sorry for your loss, he managed to say. What was your mother's name? The woman reached into her pocket and pulled out a worn photograph, protected in a plastic sleeve. She handed it to Thomas with trembling fingers. Catherine, she said. Catherine Reynolds. The world tilted beneath Thomas as he stared at the faded image. A younger version of himself stood with his arm around Catherine, both of them smiling, unaware of the fractured future awaiting them. His vision blurred, not from heat or dehydration, but from tears he couldn't hold back. "She never told me about you," the woman said softly. "Not until the end. She said she tried once, but you left before she could find the words." Thomas couldn't speak, couldn't move. The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. The argument, Catherine's insistence that they needed to talk, her disappearance. And now, this woman, this stranger with Catherine's smile and his own eyes, looking at him with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "I was born 7 months after she left," she continued. "She named me Hope because she said even in her darkest moments, I gave her something to hold on to. Hope, the daughter he never knew existed. The child who had been growing inside Catherine that night when he'd walked away. The secret she'd been trying to tell him. And now, by some cosmic coincidence, or perhaps something more, they had found each other in this vast wilderness. Thomas had given his last drop of water to a stranger, unaware that she carried his own blood. "I never stopped looking for her," Thomas whispered, his voice breaking. "For years, I searched. But I never knew. I never imagined." Hope reached out hesitantly, her fingers hovering above his hand. "She forgave you, in the end. She wanted me to find you, to tell you that." The desert stretched endlessly around them, indifferent to the human drama unfolding in its midst. Two souls connected by blood but separated by time, brought together under the most improbable circumstances, both dehydrated, both physically at their limits, but suddenly charged with a new energy, a spark of recognition that defied their dire situation. Thomas looked at Hope, his daughter, and saw both Catherine and himself reflected in her features. 28 years of absence compressed into this single, impossible moment. So many questions remained unanswered. So many years lost, never to be recovered. And hovering beneath their emotional reunion, the undeniable reality of their situation remained. They were still stranded in the desert, without water, miles from civilization. Their newfound connection would mean nothing if they couldn't find a way to survive the next 24 hours. Thomas glanced at the setting sun, calculating the cooler night hours ahead when they might be able to travel. Their chances were slim, but now he had something he'd lacked before. A reason to fight beyond mere survival. A chance to know the daughter he'd never known existed. An opportunity to make amends for the past. But first, they had to make it out alive. Thomas pushed himself to his feet, wincing as his sun-blistered skin stretched painfully across his shoulders. "We need to move while it's cooler," he said, extending his hand to Hope. "The temperature drops fast out here after sunset." She took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong despite her weakened state. As she stood, a small metal object slipped from her pocket and fell to the sand with a soft thud. Thomas bent to retrieve it. A compass, its glass face cracked but the needle still moving. "It was hers," Hope explained, her voice thick with emotion. "Mom's. She always kept it, said it was a reminder that even when you feel completely lost, there's always a way to find your bearings again." Thomas ran his thumb over the scratched surface, remembering the day he'd given it to Catherine on their first hiking trip together. "I bought this for her at that little outfitter's shop in Colorado," he whispered. "Our second anniversary." Hope's eyes widened. "She never told me where it came from, just that it was important." They stood in silence, the weight of all the unshared moments between them hanging in the air like the desert heat. 28 years of birthdays, school plays, graduations, heartbreaks, all the milestones Thomas had missed, moments that could never be reclaimed. "We should head east," Thomas finally said, studying the compass. "There's a ranger station about 15 miles that way, if I remember the map correctly." He didn't mention the grim reality. 15 miles might as well be 1,000 in their condition. They began walking. This twilight painted the landscape in purples and deep blues. Thomas instinctively shortened his stride to match Hope's pace, watching her from the corner of his eye. She moved with determination, her jaw set in a way that reminded him painfully of Catherine. "What did she tell you about me?" Thomas asked after they'd been walking in silence for nearly an hour. The question had been burning inside him, demanding to be asked despite his fear of the answer. Hope kept her eyes on the horizon. "Not much growing up. Just that you weren't ready for a family. Later, when I got older and asked more questions, she said you were a photographer who loved wild places more than people." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I used to scan nature magazines looking for your name in the photo credits." Thomas felt the words like physical blows. Is that how Catherine had seen him? A man who preferred landscape to human connection. Perhaps there was more truth to it than he wanted to admit. "Did you ever find any?" he asked. "My photos." 3, Hope replied. National Geographic, 2007. A piece on Montana wolf populations. I cut them out and kept them hidden in my diary. She paused. Mom would have been furious if she'd known. The night grew deeper around them as they walked, the temperature dropping rapidly. Stars appeared overhead, brilliant, and countless in the clear desert air. Thomas fought the urge to stop and simply stare upward, an old habit from countless nights spent waiting for the perfect shot of star trails over some remote landscape. "Your mother never knew the truth," Thomas said suddenly. "I looked for her for years. Hired private investigators, checked hospitals, wedding registries, property records, anything that might lead me to her." Hope stumbled slightly, and Thomas caught her elbow to steady her. She didn't pull away. "She was scared," Hope said after a moment. "She told me that last week in the hospital. Said she was afraid you'd resent her for trapping you with a child you never wanted." "I would have wanted you," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "If I'd known, I would have wanted you both." The stark landscape around them seemed to absorb his words, the silence that followed heavy with 3 decades of misunderstanding. They continued walking, 2 silhouettes against the vast, star-filled sky. As they crested a small rise, Hope suddenly swayed, her knees buckling. Thomas caught her before she hit the ground, alarmed by the heat radiating from her skin. "I just need a minute," she murmured, her eyes struggling to focus on his face. Thomas eased her down, propping her against a boulder. Dehydration and heat exhaustion were setting in fast, too fast. Without water, they wouldn't make it to morning, let alone the ranger station. "Tell me about your life," he said, desperate to keep her conscious and talking. "What do you do? Where do you live?" Hope's lips curved into a faint smile. "I teach 3rd grade in Phoenix. Have a cat named Einstein who thinks he runs the apartment." She paused, fighting to keep her eyes open. "I paint too. Watercolors mostly. Mom said I got that from you." Thomas blinked in surprise. "Catherine told you that?" "She kept a sketch you made of her. Said you were always drawing things when you weren't taking photos." Hope's voice was growing fainter. "I found it when I was 12, hidden in her jewelry box. It was beautiful. The way you saw her, no one had ever looked at her like that again." Thomas remembered the sketch. Catherine sitting by a window, reading, sunlight catching in her hair. He'd been so proud of capturing that moment, the peaceful concentration on her face. He hadn't known she'd kept it all these years. Hope's head drooped forward, and Thomas gently lifted her chin. "Stay with me," he urged. "We need to keep moving." "Just a few minutes," he whispered. "Then we'll go." Thomas scanned the horizon desperately. The moonlight revealed nothing but more desert, more emptiness stretching in every direction. They needed water, and soon. His gaze fell on the small succulent plants scattered across the desert floor. Desert primrose. He'd photographed them years ago for a botanical magazine, learned about their remarkable ability to store water in their thick leaves and stems. "Hope," he said urgently, "I need you to stay awake. I'm going to find us something to drink." She nodded weakly, her eyes fluttering closed despite her effort to keep them open. Thomas moved quickly, gathering several of the largest plants. With his pocket knife, he carefully sliced open the thick stems, squeezing them over his cupped palm. A few precious drops of moisture collected, not much, but perhaps enough to keep them alive until morning. He returned to Hope, gently parting her lips with his fingertips. "It's bitter," he warned as he let the plant moisture drip into her mouth. "But it's water." She swallowed reflexively, grimacing at the taste, but accepting every drop he could extract from the desert plants. When he'd given her all he could find, Thomas sat beside her, his back against the boulder, and pulled her close to share body heat as the desert night grew colder. "Why were you out here?" he asked softly. "In the desert, I mean. What made you think you'd find me here?" Hope's head rested against his shoulder, her breathing shallow but steady. "Your last published photo," she murmured. "6 months ago, desert twilight, somewhere in Arizona. The caption said you were working on a year-long project documenting desert ecosystems." She tracked him down based on a photo credit. Thomas felt a surge of something unfamiliar, pride, perhaps, or wonder at her determination. So much like her mother, yet with a stubbornness that he recognized as his own. "I flew to Arizona last week," Hope continued. "Been asking at every ranger station, every small town near the desert. Someone at a gas station recognized your name. Said they'd seen you heading out this way 3 days ago. So you just walked into the desert looking for me." Thomas couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. "Drove as far as the road went, then walked." She shivered against him. "Not my best plan." In the quiet that followed, Thomas listened to the sound of her breathing, felt the slight weight of her against his side. His daughter. The word still seemed impossible, a dream his dehydrated mind had conjured. The moon climbed higher, casting long shadows across the desert floor. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, the sound haunting and lonely in the vast silence. Thomas tightened his arm around Hope's shoulders, his thoughts churning with all that had been lost and all that might still be saved if they could survive until morning. Thomas startled awake, disoriented in the pre-dawn darkness. The desert air had turned frigid overnight, and beside him, Hope shivered violently, her breathing shallow and rapid. He placed a hand on her forehead, burning hot despite the cold air. Her condition was deteriorating faster than he'd feared. "Hope," he whispered, gently shaking her shoulder. "Hope, we need to move. The sun will be up soon." Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy. "Mom," she murmured, confusion evident in her voice. Thomas felt fear grip his chest. Delirium was setting in. A dangerous sign. "It's Thomas," he said, keeping his voice steady despite the panic rising within him. "We need to start walking before the heat returns." Hope struggled to sit up, her movements uncoordinated. "I dreamed about her," she said, her words slightly slurred. "She was trying to tell me something important." Thomas helped her to her feet, supporting most of her weight. "Save your strength," he urged. "We can talk once we find water." The eastern horizon was beginning to glow with the first hints of dawn as they set off again, Hope leaning heavily against Thomas's side. He scanned the terrain constantly, looking for any sign of the ranger station, any hint of salvation in this merciless landscape. Thomas's own head had begun to pound, his thoughts becoming sluggish and disconnected. He forced himself to focus on putting one foot in front of the other, on keeping Hope moving beside him. They had perhaps 2 hours before the sun rose fully, before the heat became unbearable again. "Did you love her?" Hope asked suddenly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. Thomas didn't hesitate. "Yes, more than I knew how to show sometimes." "Then why did you leave?" The question held no accusation, only a child's simple desire to understand. Thomas swallowed hard, his throat painfully dry. "Because I was young and stupid. Because I thought I could walk away from an argument and come back to fix things later." He paused, his next words barely audible. "I never dreamed she'd be gone when I returned." Hope nodded slightly, seemingly satisfied with his answer. They continued in silence for several minutes before she spoke again. "I have her letters. All of them. The ones she wrote to you but never sent. Thomas nearly stumbled, his heart lurching painfully in his chest. What did they say? I don't know, Hope admitted. I couldn't. I tried to read them after she died. But it felt too private somehow. Too raw. She looked up at him, her eyes clearer for a moment. I brought them with me. They're in my backpack at the rental car. Letters he would never see if they didn't survive this desert. Words Catherine had written to him across the years, thoughts she'd wanted to share but never could. The knowledge was both gift and torment. The sun crept higher, its rays beginning to warm the air around them. Thomas quickened their pace as much as Hope's weakening condition would allow, knowing the narrow window of survivable temperatures was closing rapidly. They crested a small ridge, and Thomas felt a surge of hope as he spotted a cluster of larger plants in the distance, possibly indicating a dry wash or seasonal water source. He adjusted their course, steering them toward the patchy greenery. Tell me about your photography, Hope said, her voice growing fainter with each step. Mom said you could capture the soul of a place in a single frame. Thomas smiled despite their dire situation. She would say that. She was always my best critic, saw things in my work that I didn't even realize were there. He helped Hope navigate around a large boulder. I'd spent my life chasing perfect moments in wild places, sunrises no one else was awake to see, animals that hardly ever reveal themselves to human eyes. Sounds lonely, Hope observed. The simple comment hit Thomas with unexpected force. Had he chosen solitude as punishment for losing Catherine? Had his career been an extended exercise in running away? It was, he admitted. But I told myself the work mattered, that documenting these places might help protect them. He looked down at Hope, seeing Catherine's questioning gaze in her eyes. I think maybe I was hiding. They reached the patch of vegetation, and Thomas eased Hope down into the meager shade of a scrubby mesquite tree. The ground around the plants was slightly damp, evidence of underground moisture. Hope watched as Thomas began to dig with his hands, clawing at the sandy soil with desperate intensity. What are you doing? She asked, her voice barely audible now. Finding water, he replied, not pausing in his work. An old desert survival technique. Sometimes there's moisture just below the surface. He dug deeper, ignoring the pain as his nails tore and his fingers bled. 6 inches down, then 8, the soil becoming noticeably cooler and damper. At nearly a foot deep, water began to seep into the bottom of the hole, muddy and mineral-laden, but water nonetheless. Thomas sat back on his heels, letting the precious liquid collect in the small depression. When a shallow puddle had formed, he carefully scooped some into his cupped hands and brought it to Hope's lips. It's not much, he apologized as she drank greedily from his palms, the water leaving dirty streaks down her chin. But it might keep us alive until we find help. After Hope had drunk her fill, Thomas took a few sips himself, the mineral heavy water bitter on his tongue, but more precious than any fine wine. He sat beside her in the thin shade, both of them gathering strength for the journey ahead. I named my cat after you, Hope said suddenly, her voice slightly stronger after the water. Well, not exactly after you. Thomas was too obvious. I called him Edison instead. Thomas smiled, touched in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Your mother's idea of a joke. Edison rather than Edison's rival, Tesla. Hope shook her head. My choice. Mom never told me your full name. I found it on my birth certificate after she died. Thomas Edison Walker. She gave him a weak smile. Sounds like she had a sense of humor about it, at least. Thomas laughed softly. She always did. He paused, realizing something. You changed your last name to Reynolds, like your mother's. She never changed it, Hope explained. I was born Hope Walker. Always have been. She met his eyes. She gave me your name, even when she thought you'd never know I existed. The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. All these years, Catherine had kept that connection alive, had given their daughter his name despite everything. What else had she preserved in silence? What other threads connected them across the decades and miles of separation? The sun climbed higher, its heat intensifying by the minute. Thomas looked at Hope with growing concern. The small amount of water they'd found wouldn't sustain them for long, and her condition remained critical. "We need to keep moving," he said. "The ranger station can't be too much farther." Hope nodded, gathering her strength. Thomas helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as they set off again, leaving the tiny oasis behind. They had walked perhaps half a mile when Hope suddenly stiffened beside him, her attention fixed on something in the distance. "What is that?" she whispered, pointing with a trembling hand. Thomas followed her gaze, squinting against the bright morning light. At first, he saw nothing but more desert. Then he spotted it, a dark shape moving across the landscape, kicking up a small cloud of dust. "Could be an animal," he said cautiously, not wanting to raise false hopes. "Too big," Hope countered, a spark of energy returning to her voice, "and moving too fast." As they watched, the shape resolved itself into what appeared to be a vehicle, some kind of off-road buggy or ATV bouncing across the desert floor in the distance. Thomas felt his heart rate quicken. Help, so tantalizingly close, yet still too far to reach in their condition. "We need to signal them," he said urgently, looking around for anything they could use. Hope fumbled with the zipper of her jacket pocket, her fingers clumsy with exhaustion. She pulled out a small metal object, a whistle on a keychain. "Mom always made me carry it," she explained, "for emergencies." Thomas took the whistle, raising it to his cracked lips and blowing with all the strength he could muster. The shrill sound pierced the desert air, startlingly loud in the vast silence. He blew again and again, watching the distant vehicle, praying for any sign that they'd been heard. The ATV continued on its path, seemingly oblivious to their presence. "They're not turning," Hope said, despair creeping into her voice. "They can't hear us." Thomas blew once more, then stopped to catch his breath. His vision swam, black spots dancing at the edges of his awareness. He was pushing his own limits now, his body failing after days without proper hydration. "My camera," he gasped, fumbling with his pack. "The lens, we can use it to reflect the sunlight." His fingers found the familiar shape of his camera body, and with practiced movements, he attached his largest telephoto lens. Angling it carefully to catch the sun, he created a bright flash of reflected light, directing it toward the distant vehicle. Flash. Wait. Flash again. The old distress signal pattern ingrained in him from years of wilderness travel. 3 quick flashes, followed by 3 slower ones, then 3 quick again. Teho is in the language of light. The ATV slowed, then stopped completely. Had they been seen? Hope gripped Thomas's arm, her fingers digging into his sunburned skin. "They see us," she whispered. "They have to see us." The vehicle remained stationary for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, it turned, changing course to head directly toward them. "They're coming," Thomas said, hardly daring to believe it. "They're actually coming." Hope sagged against him, relief overwhelming her remaining strength. "We're going to make it," she murmured. As the ATV drew closer, Thomas could make out 2 figures inside, park rangers, judging by their uniforms. Salvation after days of desperation. Medical help for Hope. Water, shelter, a chance for both of them to survive. A chance for him to know his daughter, to read Catherine's letters, to begin to understand the life that had continued without him for 28 years. Hope looked up at him, her eyes clearer than they had been for hours. "What happens next?" she asked quietly. "After they save us, I mean." Thomas met her gaze, seeing in it the same question that echoed in his own heart. Could a relationship be built from nothing after so many years? Could they forge a connection from the ashes of so much lost time? The ATV was close enough now that Thomas could hear the growl of its engine over the desert wind. Rescue was merely minutes away. Their immediate danger would soon be past. But as Hope's question hung in the air between them, Thomas realized that their true journey, the one that mattered most, was only beginning. The ATV grew closer, its engine growling as it navigated the uneven terrain. Thomas kept his arm firmly around Hope, supporting her weakening body. Just as relief began to wash over him, the vehicle suddenly swerved, veering sharply to the right before coming to an abrupt stop nearly 50 yards away. "What are they doing?" Hope whispered, confusion and fear mingling in her voice. Thomas squinted against the harsh sunlight. The two figures in the ATV were gesturing animatedly, pointing at something on the ground between them and the stranded pair. One ranger raised binoculars to his eyes, scanning the area. "The ground," Thomas muttered, realization dawning. "There must be a wash or ravine they can't cross." As if confirming his suspicion, one of the rangers raised a megaphone. "Stay where you are," the voice crackled across the distance. "There's a flash flood channel between us. Too steep for the vehicle. We're calling for helicopter evacuation." Thomas felt hope sag against him. "How long?" he called back, his parched voice barely carrying across the distance. 30 minutes, maybe more," came the reply. "Sit tight. We're throwing water bottles across." The ranger wound up and hurled a plastic bottle with impressive force. It arced through the air, but fell short, bouncing into the unseen ravine. A second attempt met the same fate. "Too far," Hope murmured. Thomas scanned the terrain, his photographer's eye assessing distances and angles. "We need to get closer to the edge," he said. "If we can see them better, maybe we can find a crossing point." Hope nodded weakly. With Thomas supporting most of her weight, they shuffled slowly toward where they suspected the ravine to be. After 20 agonizing steps, the ground suddenly dropped away before them, revealing a steep-walled channel carved by seasonal floodwaters. 10 feet deep and nearly 15 feet across, its sides were crumbly and unstable, impossible for the ATV to navigate and dangerous for humans in their weakened state. The rangers stood on the opposite edge, concern evident even at this distance. One spoke urgently into a radio, while the other continued trying to throw water bottles across the gap. Finally, one bottle made it, landing a few feet from Thomas. He lunged for it, nearly losing his balance in his eagerness. With trembling hands, he unscrewed the cap and held the bottle to Hope's cracked lips. "Small sips," he cautioned. "Too much too fast will make you sick." Hope obeyed, taking 3 careful swallows before Thomas gently pulled the bottle away. He took his own small sip, the cool water almost painful against his parched throat, before returning the bottle to Hope. "Helicopters on the way," the ranger called. "ETA 25 minutes. How badly are you hurt?" "Dehydration," Thomas shouted back. "My daughter needs medical attention." The word daughter fell from his lips without thought, natural and right in a way that surprised him. Across the ravine, the rangers nodded and continued speaking into their radio. Hope looked up at him, something like wonder in her eyes despite her weakness. "You called me your daughter," she said softly. "You are," Thomas replied simply. Their moment was interrupted by a sudden rumbling sound, distant but growing louder. Thomas looked up, expecting to see the helicopter arriving early, but the sky remained empty. The rangers across the ravine were shouting now, their words lost in the growing noise. One ranger pointed urgently upstream, horror evident in his gestures. Thomas turned to look, and his blood ran cold. A wall of muddy water was surging down the channel, churning with debris, a flash flood triggered by storms in the distant mountains. "We need to move," Thomas shouted, adrenaline temporarily overriding his exhaustion. He pulled Hope back from the edge, just as the leading edge of water rushed past, spraying them with muddy droplets. The rangers on the far side were frantically waving them further back. Thomas complied, half carrying Hope away from the rapidly filling channel. When they were safely distant, he eased her to the ground, his heart hammering in his chest. The sound of rushing water grew louder as the flood reached its peak, filling the ravine that had moments ago been their only obstacle. Now it was an impassable river, cutting them off completely from the rangers who had come to rescue them. Through the roar of water, Thomas heard fragments of shouted instructions. Helicopter still coming. Stay visible. Signal when. Hope's breathing had become more labored, her skin burning hot despite the water they'd shared. Thomas cradled her head in his lap, anxiety gnawing at him. 25 minutes until the helicopter arrived. Would she last that long? Stay with me, he urged, brushing sweat-soaked hair from her forehead. Help is coming. The letters, Hope murmured, her eyes fluttering. If I don't make it. Don't talk like that, Thomas interrupted fiercely. We've come too far. I'm not losing you when I just found you. A sad smile touched Hope's lips. Funny, that's what Mom said in the hospital. Said she should have told me about you years ago. She struggled to keep her eyes open. Said she was afraid I'd go looking for you and never come back. She was right to worry, Thomas said, trying to keep Hope engaged and conscious. I would have loved you so much. I might never have let you go. Would have, Hope whispered. Thomas felt tears burning behind his eyes. Do, he corrected. I do love you. From the moment you told me who you were. Hope's eyes drifted closed, her breathing shallow. Panic surged through Thomas. He shook her gently, then more firmly when she didn't respond. Hope. He patted her cheek. Hope, wake up. The helicopter will be here soon. You need to stay awake. Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Across the raging channel, Thomas could see the Rangers gesturing frantically, pointing to the sky. He looked up, scanning the horizon, but saw nothing. The rumble of the flood made it impossible to hear any approaching aircraft. Thomas reached for the water bottle, but found it empty. In desperation, he dragged Hope toward the edge of the ravine, careful to stay well back from the unstable ground. The churning water below might be their only chance. Cupping his hands, he reached toward the spray thrown up by the flood. Catching a few precious drops, he moistened Hope's lips, then her forehead, trying to cool her burning skin. The water was muddy, filled with silt and debris, but it was wet. Just hold on, he pleaded. Just a few more minutes. Hope stirred slightly, a soft moan escaping her lips. Her eyes opened briefly, unfocused and distant. Did you know? She whispered, so faintly Thomas had to bend close to hear. She always hoped you'd find us. Thomas felt something break inside him, a dam holding back decades of grief and regret. I never stopped looking, he said, his voice cracking. I swear to you, I never stopped. Hope's lips moved again, but no sound came out. Her eyes drifted closed once more. Thomas pulled her against his chest, rocking gently as tears tracked clean lines down his dust-covered face. The distant thump of helicopter blades finally became audible, growing steadily louder. Thomas looked up, shielding his eyes against the sun, and spotted the aircraft approaching from the east. Relief washed through him, immediately followed by renewed fear. Would it be in time? The Rangers across the ravine were waving bright orange flags, guiding the helicopter toward them. As it drew closer, Thomas saw it was a rescue chopper, equipped with a winch and basket. He waved frantically, pointing to Hope's unconscious form. The helicopter hovered above them, kicking up a blinding cloud of dust. Thomas bent over Hope, shielding her face from the stinging particles. Through the haze, he saw a rescuer being lowered on a cable, medical kit strapped to his back. The medic reached the ground and ran toward them, dropping to his knees beside Hope. He pressed his fingers to her neck, checking her pulse, then immediately opened his kit. How long has she been unconscious? He shouted over the roar of the helicopter. A few minutes. Thomas replied. She's severely dehydrated. Been out here for days. The medic nodded, pulling out an IV bag and quickly inserting a needle into Hope's arm. We need to get her up first, he said, gesturing to the basket being lowered on a separate cable. She's critical. Together, they lifted Hope into the rescue basket. The medic secured her with straps, then signaled to the helicopter crew. The winch engaged, and Hope began to rise slowly toward the waiting aircraft. Thomas watched her ascend, his heart in his throat. Everything that mattered was in that basket. His newfound daughter, his chance at redemption, the connection to Catherine he'd thought lost forever. Would she survive? Would he ever get to know the woman his daughter had become? Would he ever read the letters Catherine had written but never sent? As the basket reached the helicopter and was pulled inside by waiting crew members, the medic turned to Thomas. "Your turn," he said, securing a harness around Thomas's chest. "You don't look too good yourself." Thomas nodded, suddenly aware of how close he was to collapse. The medic signaled again, and the cable began to pull Thomas upward, away from the ground that had nearly claimed both their lives. As he dangled beneath the helicopter, rising slowly through the dust-filled air, Thomas gazed down at the vast desert that had brought him to the edge of death, and to the daughter he never knew existed. The same unforgiving landscape that had nearly taken everything from him had somehow, impossibly, given him a second chance. If hope survived, if it wasn't already too late. The helicopter door loomed above him, crew members reaching down to pull him inside. Beyond them, he caught a glimpse of Hope, now surrounded by medical personnel working frantically to stabilize her condition. Thomas closed his eyes, exhaustion finally overwhelming him. As consciousness began to slip away, one thought echoed in his mind. "Please, not when I just found her. Please don't take her away too." Beeping. Steady, rhythmic beeping. That was the first thing Thomas became aware of as consciousness slowly returned. His eyelids felt impossibly heavy, but he forced them open, blinking against the harsh fluorescent light. A hospital room came into focus. White walls, monitors, the antiseptic smell of medical facilities everywhere. "Welcome back," a gentle voice said from beside him. Thomas turned his head, wincing at the stiffness in his neck. A nurse stood checking his IV, her smile warm and reassuring. "Hope," he croaked, his throat raw. "My daughter, is she?" "She's stable," the nurse replied, and Thomas felt a crushing weight lift from his chest. "She's in the ICU. Severe dehydration, heat exhaustion, some kidney issues they're monitoring. But the doctors are optimistic." Thomas closed his eyes briefly, overwhelmed with relief. "When can I see her?" "Doctor says you can visit once you're steady on your feet. You've been out for nearly 18 hours. Your body needed the rest." She adjusted something on his monitor. "You were both incredibly lucky. Another few hours out there." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Thomas knew exactly how close they had come to a very different ending. "There's someone else who'd like to see you," the nurse added, nodding toward the door. "He's been waiting most of the night. Said he's a friend of yours." Thomas frowned, confused. Who would be waiting for him here? He hadn't even told anyone he was heading into the desert for this shoot. The nurse stepped out briefly, then returned with a tall, lean man in his 50s, with a weathered face and silver-streaked hair pulled back in a ponytail. Recognition dawned immediately. "Miguel," Thomas said, his voice stronger now. "How did you?" "Rangers called me," Miguel Reyes replied, moving to stand beside the bed. "Found my number in your emergency contacts. I drove up from Tucson as soon as I heard." The park ranger who had been Thomas's guide and friend on countless desert expeditions over the years looked down at him with a mixture of relief and exasperation. 20 years of showing you how to respect the desert, and you still nearly get yourself killed out there. Thomas attempted a smile. Wasn't exactly planned. Miguel's expression softened. "They told me about the young woman they found with you. Said you called her your daughter." It wasn't a question, but the curiosity was evident in his voice. "She is," Thomas confirmed, the words still new and strange on his tongue. "Though I only found out when she found me in the desert." Miguel pulled up a chair and sat, settling in for what he clearly recognized would be a long story. Thomas found himself telling everything. Catherine, the argument, the years of searching, Hope tracking him down, their desperate journey together. When he finished, Miguel was silent for a long moment. "Life has strange ways of bringing people together," he finally said. or back together. I gave her my last water, Thomas said quietly, not knowing who she was. Just a stranger in the desert. Miguel nodded. Maybe that's why the universe let you find each other. You passed the test. Thomas might have laughed at the mystical notion once, but after everything that had happened, he wasn't so sure anymore. The ranger station has your gear, Miguel said, changing the subject. Your camera equipment survived, including your memory cards. And they found the rental car where Hope left it, with her backpack still inside. I can bring it all here when you're ready. The backpack. Catherine's letters. Thomas felt his heart rate increase. Would you bring her backpack today? He asked. When I go see her, I want to have it with me. Miguel agreed, and after checking that Thomas had everything he needed, left to retrieve the items. The doctor came in shortly after, examining Thomas and declaring him well enough to visit the ICU, provided he used a wheelchair for the first trip. 2 hours later, a nurse wheeled Thomas down the corridor to the intensive care unit, Miguel walking alongside carrying Hope's backpack. Thomas had showered and changed into clean clothes the hospital had provided, but nothing could erase the lingering effects of his ordeal. The sunburn, the cracked lips, the profound exhaustion that seemed to reach into his very bones. None of that mattered as the nurse pushed open the door to Hope's room. She lay in the hospital bed, surrounded by monitors and equipment. IV lines delivered fluids and medication. Her face was still flushed with fever, but her breathing was steady and strong. The nurse positioned Thomas's wheelchair beside the bed and quietly withdrew, leaving them alone. Miguel placed the backpack on the floor nearby and stepped out as well, closing the door behind him. Thomas reached out, gently taking Hope's hand in his. Her fingers twitched at his touch, and slowly her eyes opened. Thomas, she whispered, recognition and relief washing over her face. I'm here, he said, squeezing her hand gently. We made it. A weak smile touched her lips. Thought I dreamed it all, she murmured. The helicopter. You calling me your daughter? No dream, Thomas assured her, though the doctors say we cut it pretty close. Hope's gaze drifted to the window, where desert sunlight streamed in. Funny, she said softly. After all those years of wondering about you, I never imagined our first real conversation would be while dying of thirst in the middle of nowhere. Life rarely follows the script we write for it, Thomas replied. Your mother taught me that a long time ago. At the mention of Catherine, Hope's eyes filled with tears. I miss her, she whispered. Every day. She should be here for this. In a way, she is, Thomas said. He reached down and lifted the backpack onto his lap. Miguel brought this from your car. Hope's eyes widened slightly. The letters, she said. Thomas nodded. I won't read them unless you want me to. They were meant for me, but she gave them to you. It's your decision. Hope was quiet for a moment, her gaze thoughtful despite her weakness. She wanted you to have them, she finally said. That's why she kept them all those years, why she told me about them before she died. She paused, gathering strength. I think she was afraid to send them while she was alive, afraid of what might happen if you came back. And now? Thomas asked. Now she's gone, Hope said simply. And I'm here. And somehow, against all odds, so are you. She gestured weakly toward the backpack. Read them, please. I think it's time. With trembling hands, Thomas unzipped the bag and found a bundle of envelopes tied with a faded blue ribbon. Some were yellowed with age, others newer, all addressed to him in Catherine's distinctive handwriting. He carefully untied the ribbon and selected the oldest envelope, postmarked nearly 28 years ago. The hospital room faded away as he began to read. Catherine's voice seemed to fill the silence, as clear and present as if she were standing beside him. Her words, filled with anger and hurt at first, then gradually softening over the years to acceptance, understanding, even forgiveness, painted the picture of the life he had missed. She wrote of Hope's first steps, first words, first day of school. of single motherhood struggles and joys, of moments when she almost sent the letters, almost picked up the phone, almost saw him out, of watching their daughter grow into a woman with his eyes and her smile, his stubborn determination and her compassionate heart. The final letter, dated just weeks before her death, held no recriminations, no regrets, only peace and a simple request. If Hope ever found him, Catherine asked Thomas to love their daughter enough for both of them. When he finished reading, Thomas looked up to find Hope watching him, her eyes filled with questions. "She forgave me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Long before the end, she forgave me." Hope nodded. She let go of the anger years ago, said holding on to it was like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die. A small smile touched her lips. Mom was big on metaphors. "I remember," Thomas said softly. Then, after a moment, "What happens now, Hope, after we heal? I mean," she considered the question, her gaze steady despite her weakened state. "I don't know exactly. We can't make up for 28 years overnight." "No," Thomas agreed. "We can't." "But," Hope continued, "we could start with coffee. Once we're both allowed caffeine again." Her smile grew slightly stronger. "I have a 2-week break from school coming up. Maybe you could show me how to use that fancy camera of yours. Take me to some of those wild places you love photographing." Thomas felt something unfold in his chest, a cautious joy, a tentative hope for the future. "I'd like that," he said. "Very much." Outside the window, the desert stretched toward the horizon, harsh and beautiful and indifferent to human concerns. The same landscape that had nearly claimed their lives had, in its unforgiving way, given them both a second chance. Not to rewrite the past, that was beyond anyone's power, but perhaps to create something new from what remained, something neither of them had dared to imagine possible. Thomas reached out, taking Hope's hand once more. As father and daughter sat together in the quiet hospital room, surrounded by Catherine's words and their shared history, the future opened before them, uncertain and fragile, but filled with possibility. Like water in the desert, rare, precious, and all the more valuable for having almost been lost.